The wedding invitation arrived in a heavy envelope, the gold letters shimmering as if they carried more than joy. My hands trembled as I held it because it wasn't just an announcement of my son's marriage, it was a reminder of the silence between us, of the years I had watched him drift farther away. I didn't know his bride. I didn't know her family, and yet I knew this day would change everything. A mother can sense when a storm is coming, and deep inside I felt that at this wedding I would not simply be a guest. I would be tested, humiliated, and forced to reveal the truth I had buried for decades. The morning air in Vermont still carried the damp chill of spring when I opened my eyes. From my bedroom window I could see the bare branches of the maples just beginning to bud, the garden still wet with dew. I padded into the kitchen of my small cedar-framed house and switched on the kettle. It was my ritual everyday coffee in my favorite blue-rimmed mug, a slow walk to the porch, and a quiet glance at the yard I had tended for more than 2 decades. The silence of the town was always comforting. Neighbors walked their dogs, a couple of children hurried toward the school bus stop, and life in its ordinary rhythm went on. I had lived in this house in Brattleboro for 22 years, long enough to know every creak in the floorboards, every squeak in the porch railing. It wasn't a mansion, not even large, but it had become my anchor. I had painted the shutters myself when I turned 60, and I still polished the wood banister every spring. The neighbors saw me as a retired accountant, a widow who liked her garden and lent a hand to local shops with their taxes during April. They never knew more, and that was how I preferred it. The knock on the door came as I was pouring hot water into the French press. Sharp, almost urgent. I wiped my hands and went to the front hall. Outside stood Jim the mailman holding out a thick cream-colored envelope. "Special delivery for you, Mrs. Hayes," he said with a polite smile. I thanked him, feeling an odd weight in my hand as soon as I took it. The envelope shimmered with gold, embossing the kind reserved for weddings or ceremonies too important to ignore. I carried it back into the kitchen, placed it on the table, and stared. My heart beat faster. I already knew who it was from. Daniel, my only son. He lived in New York now, working at a technology firm, and though he was just 3 hours away by train, the distance between us felt far greater. 5 years had passed since he last stayed with me for more than a weekend. Our phone calls had shrunk from once a week to once a month, then to holidays, and lately they barely lasted 5 minutes. I ran my finger along the flap and finally broke the seal. Inside lay the ornate invitation: "Daniel Hayes and Vanessa Tramble invite you to celebrate their marriage, June 3rd, 2023, New York City." My throat tightened. My boy was getting married. I sank into the chair, the wood groaning under me, and read it again and again, as if the words might change. Daniel had found someone, a woman named Vanessa, and here I was learning about her through an invitation rather than a conversation. There was a handwritten note tucked inside. The familiar slant of his letters made my chest ache. "Mom, I know we haven't seen each other much these past years, but it's important to me that you come. Please." Just those few words. Simple. Yet I could almost hear the tension in his voice, the mix of hesitation and longing. My Daniel rarely asked me for anything. Even as a boy, he had been fiercely independent, sometimes too much so. I looked around my kitchen, the polished counter, the jar of peonies I had picked yesterday, and felt an odd loneliness. He had grown up in this very house, running up and down these same stairs. I remembered his laughter echoing through the hallway, the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings, the way he used to sit at this very table with his math homework. Now all that seemed like a lifetime ago. I got up and opened the back door, stepping onto the porch. The garden greeted me with early daffodils pushing through the soil. Mrs. Collins across the street waved as she watered her tulips, and I waved back, hiding the tremor in my hand. Life around me looked so ordinary, so unchanged. But I knew in that moment that my own life had just shifted. A wedding was not just a celebration. It meant family merging, new ties, and sometimes new fractures. I went back inside, set the invitation on the counter, and sat quietly. Thoughts tumbled. Who was this Vanessa? Why had Daniel spoken so little about her? What kind of family did she come from? I thought of Christmas when he called briefly and mentioned attending an advertising conference. Perhaps that was when they met. It felt so distant, so vague. And now here she was about to become my daughter-in-law. I pressed the invitation flat against the table, the embossed letters gleaming under the kitchen light. My eyes blurred as I whispered to myself, "This will not just be a wedding. It will be a test." My voice sounded strange in the quiet kitchen, as though I were preparing myself for something unseen. And with the mug of coffee now cold beside me, I sat there a long while listening to the old house creak, as though it too understood the change that was coming. I still remember the morning when Brian left us. It was the summer of 1991, a Tuesday like any other. Daniel was 7 years old, still asleep in his pajamas, clutching his stuffed bear. I walked into the kitchen and found a folded note on the table next to an empty coffee cup. The handwriting was Brian's, quick and careless. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I can't do this anymore. I'm not cut out for family life." That was it. No explanation, no warmth, just a cold slice of words that cut deeper than any blade could. By the time I finished reading, his closet was already empty, his car gone from the driveway. I stood there frozen, my hands trembling, the morning sun slanting across the note. The silence of the house was deafening. I looked toward the hallway, half expecting him to return, but all I heard was Daniel's small footsteps coming down the stairs. He rubbed his eyes and asked, "Where's Dad?" My throat locked. I forced a smile that felt like breaking glass and told him Dad had to go away for a while. He didn't press me. Children are sometimes wiser than we think. The years after that were harder than I let anyone see. I worked long hours balancing the accounts of local businesses, cooking dinner late at night, helping Daniel with his homework under the yellow glow of a desk lamp. There were nights when I sat in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I could carry it all alone. But I had no choice. Daniel needed me, and I swore I would never fail him. Then, in the spring of 1996, everything changed again. My cousin Arthur Cole, a reclusive historian from Boston, passed away. Arthur had no wife, no children, few friends. At the funeral, his lawyer called me aside. "He left everything to you," he said, handing me a thick envelope. I thought it must be a mistake, but inside were papers, deeds, bank statements, stocks. Arthur, eccentric as he was, had amassed a fortune. A mansion in Beacon Hill, rare artifacts, and a sizable bank account. At first I didn't know what to do. I was overwhelmed by grief and responsibility. I sold the mansion. Too large, too full of echoes. And with the guidance of a young financial advisor named Thomas Miller, I invested the money. Oil companies, technology firms, pharmaceuticals. It was the mid-1990s, the market was booming, and Thomas had a keen eye. I was cautious, but he convinced me to take measured risks. The numbers began to climb. Slowly at first, then like a snowball rolling downhill, growing larger with every year. By the time Daniel was finishing college, the portfolio was worth hundreds of millions. And now, nearly 3 decades later, it had surpassed $1.8 billion. Even Thomas sounded odd when he updated me. But no one in Brattleboro suspected a thing. To the neighbors, I was still just Margaret, the quiet widow who drove her dusty 12-year-old Volvo and clipped coupons at the grocery store. I chose to keep it that way. When Daniel was in high school, I watched him get his first job at a diner, coming home smelling of grease and pride. He bought his own computer with those wages, saved every dollar. I could have bought him 10 computers, a house, anything he wanted. But I didn't. I told myself I was protecting him, letting him build his own backbone instead of leaning on mine. Still, there were moments when the secret weighed heavy, like the day he took out student loans. He didn't know I quietly paid them off his sophomore year under the guise of an anonymous scholarship. I never told him. To this day, he believes he carried that burden himself. That evening, after receiving the wedding invitation, I poured myself a glass of water and dialed Thomas. His voice, steady and warm, answered right away. "Margaret, I was just about to call you. The quarterly report came in. The returns from the tech sector have been phenomenal. Your position in renewable energy doubled this year. I listened, my mind only half on the numbers. Thomas, I said quietly, do you ever think some secrets can't last forever? He paused. You mean Daniel? Yes, I twisted the phone cord around my finger like I used to years ago. He's getting married. How long can I keep pretending to be an ordinary woman? How long before he resents me for hiding the truth? Secrets always come out. Margaret Thomas replied, the question is whether you want to control that moment or let it control you. His words echoed after we hung up. I sat in the living room, the invitation on my lap, the family photo on the mantel catching my eye. Daniel, age 12, grinning in his baseball uniform. Me beside him, younger, then lines, softer eyes, less guarded. I reached out and touched the glass frame, my vision blurring. Would he look at me differently if he knew? Would he see me not as his mother but as a bank vault? Would the warmth between us already thin vanish completely? The thought chilled me. I pressed the photo to my chest and closed my eyes. The house creaked as the evening set in. Outside, the sky turned violet and the crickets began their chorus. I knew sleep would not come easily that night. Somewhere in New York, my son was preparing for his wedding, while here in Vermont, I was clutching a secret that had defined our entire lives. And though no one else could hear it, the weight of that silence was louder than anything. The train screeched as it slowed into Penn Station, the air thick with the scent of metal, and too many bodies pressed into one place. I clutched the handle of my suitcase and followed the crowd through the tunnel, the noise and chaos a sharp contrast to the quiet streets of Brattleboro. My heart thudded as I searched the throngs of commuters, and then I saw him. Daniel, tall, well-dressed, his dark hair neatly combed. For a moment he was still the boy who used to run into my arms after school. Mom. He smiled broadly and pulled me into a quick hug. His cologne was unfamiliar, crisp and modern, the smell of a life far away from mine. Before I could say much, he turned slightly and gestured. This is Vanessa. The woman beside him stepped forward, tall blonde, her hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She wore a tailored cream blazer and heels that clicked confidently on the station floor. Her handshake was firm, her smile practiced. Mrs. Hayes. It's wonderful to finally meet you. Her eyes swept over me, pausing on my cardigan, the scuffed corner of my suitcase. It was a glance too brief to be obvious, but I felt it a quick assessment, as if she were appraising a piece of furniture. It's good to meet you too, Vanessa, I answered. My voice was calm, but my palms had begun to sweat. Daniel, oblivious to the tension, grabbed my suitcase. Let's get out of here. The traffic's not great today, but I parked close. We stepped out onto the busy street. Horns blared, people shouted into their phones, cabs swerved. Vanessa slipped easily into the flow as though she belonged to this rhythm. She walked just ahead of me, talking rapidly. We just wrapped a campaign for a global cosmetics brand, she said, her voice carrying over the noise. It's been all over Times Square, maybe you've seen it. We won an industry award last month. Next quarter, I'll be leading a team in Los Angeles for another launch. It's exhausting, but exhilarating. Daniel grinned proudly. She's amazing at what she does, Mom. Her agency is one of the best in Manhattan. I nodded, murmuring something polite. The truth was, I hadn't seen the campaign, though I owned stock in the parent company without her knowing. I let her words wash over me as I kept my eyes on the endless tide of people. At the car, Daniel opened the trunk and placed my bag inside. Vanessa slipped into the driver's seat, clearly at ease, while Daniel climbed in beside her. I settled in the back. She glanced at me in the rearview mirror, her lips curving into a smile that never reached her eyes. As she pulled into traffic, she continued her monologue, listing clients' travel dinners with executives. Then her tone shifted just slightly as she glanced again into the mirror. Life in Vermont must be so peaceful. All that space-quiet nights. I imagine simplicity suits you. Her voice was smooth, but I heard the edge beneath it. Simplicity. The word lingered like a small cut. I looked down at the sleeve of my cardigan, the faded fabric I had worn 100 times, and smiled faintly. peaceful. Yes, it has its charm. Daniel chuckled. Mom loves her garden. You'd be surprised how much she can grow in that little yard. Vanessa gave a polite nod, clearly uninterested, and turned the conversation back to her career. I watched the city roll by outside the window. Neon billboards, glass towers, crowds on every corner. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, older, quieter. A knot formed in my stomach, not from the chaos of the city, but from the feeling that I was stepping into something I didn't yet understand. As we crossed into Midtown, Daniel pointed out restaurants he thought I'd like, his voice filled with excitement. I tried to listen, but my eyes kept meeting Vanessa's in the rearview mirror. Her gaze was sharp, calculating, and in that moment I felt it, an unease that crawled up my spine. Something told me this wedding was not going to be simple. The restaurant glowed with golden light chandeliers scattering reflections across polished marble floors. A long table stretched down the center of the private dining room, already crowded with relatives, friends, and colleagues from Vanessa's side of the family. Waiters in black uniforms moved gracefully between the chairs, pouring wine and setting down plates of hors d'oeuvres that looked more like sculptures than food. Daniel placed a hand on my back as we entered. Mom, let me introduce you to everyone. He said, his voice tinged with nervous energy. I could feel him willing the evening to be smooth, but my chest tightened as eyes turned toward me. Conversations dipped for half a second before resuming, though quieter, as if I had walked onto a stage where I didn't belong. At the far end of the room, a tall man with gray at his temples rose from his chair. This must be Margaret, he said warmly enough. His handshake was firm but brief. Robert Tramble, Vanessa's father. He smiled, but there was a measured distance in his tone, like he had already filed me into a category. Then Olivia appeared beside him, elegant in a sleek black dress, diamonds flashing at her ears. Her perfume reached me before her voice did. Mrs. Hayes, she said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Finally we meet. I forced a smile, returning the greeting, but the way she looked me over. From my modest navy dress to the shoes I'd polished twice before leaving Vermont, left no doubt she was taking inventory. We sat Daniel between me and Vanessa, Olivia and Robert across the table, surrounded by cousins and friends whose laughter filled the air. For a while, the dinner was pleasant enough. Plates of seared salmon and truffle risotto were passed down, wine glasses clinked. People shared stories of Vanessa's childhood. Her piano recitals, her high school debate, championships, her summer trips to Paris. Then Olivia leaned forward, her smile broadening as if she were about to share a compliment. "It's remarkable, really," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those around us, "that Daniel, coming from such a small town, managed to achieve what he has in New York. Quite the surprise." A few polite chuckles rippled down the table. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his napkin. I felt the words hit like small blades. "Brattleboro has always been good to us," I replied gently. "It's a small town, yes, but not without its own strengths." Olivia's eyes glimmered as she sipped her wine. "Of course, simplicity has its charm." Vanessa nodded slightly, as if endorsing her mother's words, but said nothing. Daniel cleared his throat and tried to redirect the conversation to work, but the atmosphere had shifted. Each new remark from Olivia was another needle hidden in silk. When a toast was made to the couple, Olivia raised her glass higher than anyone. To Daniel and Vanessa, she declared, "May your union bring prosperity, happiness, and above all, harmony, and may our families always find common ground in lifestyle and taste." Her gaze slid deliberately toward me as she emphasized the last words. The table laughed and clapped, oblivious to the undercurrent. Daniel forced a smile, his face flushed. I lifted my glass as well, my hand steady, though my heart was pounding. As the evening wore on, I found myself more and more isolated. Conversations flowed easily among them, about designers, travel destinations, investment properties. None of it included me. I sat quietly tasting my food without appetite, listening, observing. The room felt smaller, tighter, as though I had been placed in the center of a circle I could never step into. When dessert arrived, Olivia leaned closer, her voice pitched just for me. "You must find all this rather overwhelming. I imagine Vermont doesn't offer quite the same sophistication." I met her gaze, holding it longer than was polite. "It offers a different kind of wealth," I said softly, "one that can't always be measured at a table like this." She blinked, her smile faltering for just a second before returning bright as ever. "Well, I suppose we all value different things." I sipped my coffee, choosing silence. I had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than any retort. By the time the plates were cleared and chairs scraped back, my head throbbed from the noise, the laughter, the subtle daggers dressed as compliments. I stood when Daniel did my hand, brushing his arm. He gave me a quick apologetic look but said nothing. At the door, Olivia swept past us, gracefully pausing only to lift her glass one more time. "Here's to our families. Mrs. Hayes," she said, her eyes glinting. "May we always remain aligned in our way of life." Her words lingered like perfume as she disappeared into the night, leaving me with the sting of being measured and found lacking. And as I stepped into the cool Manhattan air, I realized I had never felt more like an outsider. The door of my hotel room closed behind me with a hollow thud. I leaned against it for a moment, my body heavy from the weight of the evening. The laughter, the sidelong glances, Olivia's cutting words cloaked in civility. They replayed in my head like an unwelcome chorus. I slipped off my shoes and dropped onto the edge of the bed, staring at the muted glow of the city beyond the window. For the first time in years, I felt truly small. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. I almost ignored it, assuming it was Daniel with another hurried apology. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw a name I hadn't expected: Thomas Miller. "Margaret," his familiar voice said when I answered, steady and grounding. "I heard you were in New York. I'm here on business too. Can we meet relief washed over me?" "Thomas, I'd like that. There's a cafe just around the corner from my hotel." Half an hour later, I sat in a small booth at a cafe with worn brick walls and the comforting smell of roasted beans. Thomas walked in, his salt and pepper hair catching the light, his suit impeccable as always. He greeted me with a warm smile before sliding into the seat across from me. "You look tired," he said, gently studying me. "I feel it." I admitted. I told him everything: the dinner, Olivia's thinly veiled insults, the way Daniel sat silent, trapped between loyalty and embarrassment. As I spoke, the words tumbled out, weighted with years of holding things back. Thomas listened, nodding occasionally, his hands folded on the table. When I finished, he leaned closer. "Don't let their arrogance shake you. They only see what you allow them to see. The truth. Margaret is in your hands. That's your strength." I let his words sink in, sipping the bitter coffee that had gone cold. "Sometimes I wonder if Daniel would see it as strength," I murmured. "He will," Thomas said firmly. "Maybe not right now, but when the moment comes, he'll understand." His certainty steadied me. For a long time we sat in comfortable silence, the bustle of the cafe around us, a buffer against the storm I carried inside. Later that night, back in my hotel room, the phone rang again. Richard Lawson's voice came through the line, formal but reassuring. "Margaret, I just wanted to confirm. I've reviewed everything. The documents are ready whenever you decide to sign. Adjustments to the will, the charitable trust, all of it." "Thank you, Richard," I said quietly. "I may need them sooner than I thought." After we hung up, I stood at the desk sifting through the mail I had brought with me from Vermont. Among the bills and notes, one envelope stood out, an official letter from the town hall. I opened it and read the neat handwriting of Mayor Linda Parker. She was proposing a partnership to restore Greenfield Park, a project the community had long dreamed of, but never had the funds to achieve. I traced the lines with my finger, imagining the playgrounds, the gardens, the laughter of children filling the space. But I folded the letter back carefully and slipped it into my bag. "Not yet," I whispered. Timing mattered, and I knew the moment hadn't come. I walked to the bathroom and caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was older than I remembered. lines etched deeper around my mouth, silver streaks at my temples. Yet there was steel there too beneath the tired eyes. I touched the cool glass, a spark of resolve flickering inside me. No one, I told my reflection, will strip me of my dignity. The city hummed outside, restless and bright, but in that quiet room I felt the first stirrings of something steadier than anger. Determination. I drew the curtains shut, turned off the light, and let the darkness wrap around me, knowing the real test had only just begun. The morning of the wedding broke clear and bright, the kind of day people like to call perfect. I stood by the window of my hotel room, holding up the silver-gray dress I had bought years ago on a trip to Milan. I had rarely worn it, saving it for an occasion I thought worthy. Today, it seemed, was that occasion. I slipped it carefully from its hanger and laid it across the bed, smoothing the fabric with my hand. A soft knock came at the door. When I opened it, a young woman with a large black makeup case smiled at me. "Mrs. And Hayes? I'm Ashley. Miss Tramble asked me to help you get ready." Her words carried an assumption of authority, but her tone was kind enough. I let her in. She set her tools neatly on the desk and began unpacking brushes and palettes. "Vanessa's mother mentioned you'd prefer something light," she said, but I stopped her gently. "Let's keep it natural," I told her. "Elegant but not overdone. This is my son's wedding, not a photo shoot." Ashley's face brightened. "Of course, I'll keep it simple." For the next hour, she worked quietly, occasionally asking my opinion. The mirror revealed a woman I recognized but hadn't seen in a while. Lines softened eyes, more alert lips touched with just enough color. When she was done, she stepped back and smiled. "You look beautiful." "Mrs. Hayes?" Dignified. I touched her hand, grateful. "Thank you, Ashley." That's exactly what I wanted. By late morning, Daniel arrived to pick me up. He was in a black tuxedo, his bow tie slightly askew, his face lit with nervous energy. "Mom," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "You look amazing." I laughed softly. "And you look like a man about to get married." The ride to the church passed in a blur. Outside the window, New York seemed suspended between chaos and celebration. When we arrived, the Gothic facade of St. Mark's loomed tall, its stone walls weathered but proud. Bells tolled above, echoing across the street. My heart pounded as Daniel escorted me inside. The sanctuary smelled of old wood and lilies. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, scattering color across the pews. Ushers guided me to the front row near the altar. I smoothed my dress and clasped my hands in my lap, breathing slowly, trying to anchor myself. Guests shuffled in their whispers, rising like a tide. Vanessa's family filled the rows across from me, sleek and polished. I caught sight of Olivia sweeping down the aisle in a deep red dress, every move deliberate. She leaned toward Vanessa, whispered something, and they both glanced at me with matching expressions. Lips curved, eyes narrowed. I turned my gaze to the altar, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The organ began its prelude, a swell of sound that silenced the room. Daniel walked to the front, his face pale, his hands fiddling with his cufflinks. He turned once, met my eyes, and gave me a quick, nervous smile. My chest tightened with pride and worry all at once. Then the doors opened at the back, and every head turned. Vanessa appeared radiant in a lace gown that clung perfectly to her frame, her blonde hair swept into a flawless bun. She held her father's arm. Chin lifted, a smile spread across her lips. The photographer's flash burst as she walked down the aisle. Daniel's face lit up, all nerves replaced with adoration. I watched him, not her, my son grown and trembling at the edge of a new life. My throat ached with emotion. No matter my doubts, I wanted him happy. I wanted this day to be his. The ceremony moved forward, readings, hymns, vows spoken in voices thick with emotion. Daniel's words wavered only once, when he promised to love and protect Vanessa in all circumstances. Vanessa's voice, clear and strong, carried through the vaulted ceiling, each syllable sharp as crystal. As I listened, a flicker of unease tugged at me. The way she glanced at her mother, the way Olivia nodded almost imperceptibly as if orchestrating the moment. Still, when the priest pronounced them husband and wife and the guests erupted in applause, I stood with everyone else clapping, smiling through the wetness in my eyes. Daniel kissed his bride radiant with joy. I told myself to hold on to that image. But when the newlyweds turned to walk down the aisle together, I caught Olivia's gaze across the sanctuary. She was staring directly at me, her smile thin, her eyes glinting with something that sent a chill down my spine. It was as if she were saying without words, "This isn't over." The ballroom shimmered with light from crystal chandeliers, every facet scattering brightness across the gilded walls. Music swelled from the string quartet, tucked into a corner, their bows moving in perfect harmony. Guests filled the room with laughter and chatter, glasses clinking, voices rising in cheerful congratulations. The three-tiered cake adorned with white roses made of sugar stood proudly at the center, a spectacle waiting for its moment. I sat at my table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching Daniel and Vanessa glide from group to group, smiling for photographs. My heart twisted at the sight of my son beaming, his arm draped around his new wife. I wanted this day to be his joy, even if a knot of unease still sat heavy in my chest. When the announcement came for the cake, cutting, the crowd gathered clapping. As Daniel and Vanessa pressed their hands together over the silver knife, flashbulbs lit up, applause thundered as the blade sank through the sugar and sponge. Daniel offered Vanessa the first bite, and she laughed, dabbing icing on his lip. It was a picture-perfect moment. The music swelled again as the waiters prepared to serve slices. Guests cheered, lifting their glasses. I pushed my chair back, ready to rise and mingle to offer my quiet congratulations. That was when Olivia appeared. She moved through the crowd with effortless grace, her red gown shimmering under the chandeliers. In her hand, she carried a long-stemmed glass filled to the brim with red wine. I noticed the deliberate way she approached, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "Mrs. Hayes," she said sweetly, pausing beside me, "such a lovely evening, don't you think?" Before I could answer, she shifted her stance, her face twisting into a mask of mock surprise. Her hand tipped forward, and in one fluid motion the entire glass of wine cascaded over me. The shock of cold liquid struck first, then the sticky warmth as it spread down my shoulders, soaking the silver fabric of my dress. Gasps erupted around me. The once glimmering gown clung heavy and ruined, stained a violent crimson. My hair dripped, strands plastered against my cheeks. For a moment, the ballroom was silent. Then Olivia leaned closer, her voice low but sharp enough to slice through the air. "Poor woman," she said with a cruel smile. "This color suits you better." The words cut deeper than the wine ever could. I sat frozen, humiliated, the room spinning as whispers swelled. From a nearby table I heard stifled laughter. Friends of Vanessa covering their mouths, their eyes glittering with amusement. The sound burned in my ears. I turned, slightly searching for Daniel. He stood a few feet away, his face stricken eyes, wide lips parted, as if he'd forgotten how to breathe. Beside him, Vanessa raised her hand to her mouth in feigned horror. "Oh my God, Mom!" she exclaimed, though the sparkle in her eye betrayed her lack of concern. Guests shifted uneasily, unsure whether to comfort me or avoid the spectacle. Waiters froze with trays in hand. The music faltered, the quartet bowing to silence. I reached for a napkin on the table, dabbing at my face, my hands trembling but steady enough to maintain some composure. My dress clung to me, heavy, ruined, but I forced myself to sit tall. I would not let them see me break. Daniel finally moved, stepping toward me. "Mom." His voice cracked, his eyes darting between me and Olivia. He looked lost, trapped in a nightmare he didn't know how to wake from. I raised a hand slightly, stopping him from speaking further. My heart hammered, but I kept my face calm. Inside, shame and fury battled a storm threatening to tear through me. But I swallowed it, each breath steadying me against the tide. All around, the silence lingered, the weight of humiliation pressing down like a stone. Olivia straightened, lifting her chin as if nothing had happened, her glass now empty, her eyes glittering with triumph. And in that moment, as the wine dripped from my hair and stained the floor beneath me, I knew this was no accident. It was a declaration, a message that I was not welcome, not worthy. The humiliation was complete, and yet beneath it something else stirred. A spark I hadn't felt in years. Something strong, dangerous, and unyielding, waiting for the right moment to rise. I rose slowly from my chair, the fabric of my dress clinging heavy and damp against my skin. The hush in the ballroom was suffocating, every eye fixed on me, waiting to see if I would crumble. My hand found a linen napkin, and I dabbed at my face, my movements deliberate, steady. The humiliation still burned, but something stronger surged in me. Resolve. I walked to the front of the room, each step leaving faint drops of red on the polished floor. A waiter moved instinctively to intercept me, but I waved him aside. At the podium, the microphone stood unattended. I reached for it, my fingers firm. The murmur of whispers dimmed until there was only silence. When I spoke, my voice carried through the hall, low and calm, but resonant. You see me sitting here, a widow from Vermont, in an old dress and worn shoes. You see what you want to see. A poor woman. I paused, letting the words hang. Faces leaned closer, ears straining. But the truth is, for the last 25 years I have managed a fortune of over $1.8 billion. If I wanted, I could buy this hotel tonight and every chandelier in it. Gasps rippled like a wave across the crowd. Chairs shifted, hands flew to mouths, cameras clicked furiously. My eyes found Olivia in the front, her face drained of color, the satisfaction that had curled her lips moments before now erased. Vanessa beside her froze as though she had forgotten how to breathe. I held their gaze for a beat before turning to the room at large. I chose a quiet life in Vermont because money doesn't define me. But tonight, you should know exactly who you tried to humiliate. The silence broke with a man's voice, steady and unmistakable. She speaks the truth. It was Richard Lawson rising from his seat near the middle of the room. He adjusted his glasses and held up a folder. I have represented Mrs. Hayes's estate for more than 15 years. Every word she just spoke is fact. Then Thomas stood, his broad frame cutting a figure of certainty. And I've advised her investments since the beginning. If any of you doubt it, I can assure you, you are looking at one of the wealthiest women in this country. The ballroom erupted. Guests whispered frantically, phones raised to capture photos, faces twisted with disbelief. I heard my name passed from table to table, a buzz spreading like fire. I remained at the podium, shoulders back, my chest rising with controlled breaths. I no longer felt the wet weight of the wine in my dress. Instead, I felt the weight lift, decades of silence broken in an instant. Daniel stepped forward, his face pale with shock. Mom. His voice was hushed raw, as if the world had tilted beneath his feet. I gave him a small nod, a promise to explain later, and turned back to the crowd. Wealth, I said, isn't measured by silk dresses or glittering jewels. It's measured by character. And tonight, character has been tested. For a long moment, no one moved. Then someone began to clap. Slowly, awkwardly, others joined. The sound built until it echoed against the high ceilings, though I could feel it was less celebration than astonishment. I placed the microphone back on its stand and stepped down. Guests parted as I walked past, their eyes wide, some with newfound respect, others with shame. Olivia slumped in her chair, her glass trembling in her hand. Vanessa sat rigid, her cheeks flushed crimson, her practiced composure gone. When I returned to my seat, the music tentatively resumed, but the air was changed. No longer was I invisible, a shadow at the edges of the room. Every conversation, every glance now orbited around me. I picked up my fork, cut a small piece of cake, and tasted it as though nothing had happened. The sweetness lingered on my tongue, but it was the silence in my own heart that I savored most. The silence of no longer hiding. I had barely stepped back into the quiet of the hotel lobby when I heard my name. Daniel hurried toward me, his bow tie loose, his hair disheveled as though he'd been running his hands through it nonstop. His eyes were wide, raw, and uncertain. Mom, he said, his voice trembling. Why? Why did you hide this from me all these years?" I looked at him. My son grown now, a man with a career, a wife, a life of his own. And I saw the boy he once was, the one who used to beg me for just a little more allowance, who worked shifts at the diner to save for a computer. My throat tightened. "Daniel," I said softly, "I wanted you to grow up knowing the value of work. I wanted you to understand what it means to earn, not to depend on money you didn't create. I've seen what wealth can do to people. It warps them, blinds them. I didn't want that for you." He sank into one of the velvet chairs in the corner, running both hands over his face. "All those nights, Mom. I worked double shifts during college. I thought we were barely scraping by. I took loans. I felt guilty for even asking you for help." I sat across from him, leaning forward. "I know. I watched you push yourself, and it broke my heart. But I also saw you become strong, determined. You learned resilience, Daniel. That's worth more than any check I could have written." His eyes glistened. For a long moment he didn't speak, his gaze drifting toward the marble floor as though searching for answers there. Then footsteps clicked across the lobby. "Var tonight kissing?" Vanessa appeared, her mascara smudged, her cheeks flushed from tears. She rushed to Daniel, clutching at his arm. "Daniel, please," she cried, her voice shaking. "I had no idea, I swear. I never meant to hurt your mother. It was just stress nerves. Please believe me." Daniel didn't meet her eyes. He stared at the wall behind her, jaw tight. The way he looked at her now was different, detached, as though a veil had lifted. Vanessa's grip tightened. "I love you. You have to know that. Everything tonight. It wasn't me. It was the pressure, all these people, my mother." Her voice cracked, and then Olivia's voice cut through the space, sharp and insistent. She strode in chin high, trying to command the room. "Enough of this nonsense. It was an accident, Margaret. The wine, the stumble. It was clumsy, nothing more." I rose slowly, facing her. "Accidents don't come with cruel words, Olivia. Everyone heard you. The lobby, half empty but not deserted, seemed to pause with us." Guests passing through slowed their steps, catching pieces of the scene. Olivia's expression wavered for a moment before she steeled herself again, her lips pressing into a thin line. Daniel finally spoke, his voice hollow. "Mom's right. It wasn't an accident. I saw the look on your face." Olivia's eyes flickered, searching for an escape. Vanessa turned desperately toward me. "Mrs. Hayes, please. I was wrong. I was stupid. Don't let this ruin everything." I met her gaze but said nothing. The silence stretched heavy and merciless. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a woman scribbling quickly in a notepad. Sophie Bennett, the young reporter who had been at the reception. She tucked her pen behind her ear, her expression focused, already piecing the story together that would find its way into tomorrow's paper. Daniel sank back into the chair, his face pale. "This marriage..." He faltered, looking from Vanessa to Olivia, then back at me. "What have I done?" I wanted to reach for him, to pull him close, like I did when he was a child, but I stayed still. He needed to feel the weight of his own realization. Vanessa knelt beside him, clutching his hand. "It doesn't have to be this way. We can fix it. We can move past this." But Daniel's eyes didn't soften. He looked at her like she was a stranger. "I don't know if I can," he whispered. The words hung in the air, fragile but final, and in that moment I knew something inside him had shifted forever. The morning light crept through the curtains of my hotel room, casting long streaks across the carpet. I had hardly slept, my mind replaying the humiliation, the revelation, and Daniel's broken expression afterward. By the time the sun rose, my decision was already made. At 10 o'clock sharp, I pushed open the glass doors of Richard Lawson's law office on Madison Avenue. The receptionist looked up with polite surprise, then quickly ushered me into the conference room. Richard was already waiting, a thick folder in front of him. He stood as I entered, shaking my hand firmly. "Margaret," he said, his tone both professional and kind. "I assume you're ready." "Yes," I replied, taking my seat. My voice felt steadier than I expected. He slid the folder toward me. These are the amendments we discussed. Vanessa Tramble has been removed entirely. Daniel will inherit a portion, sufficient for comfort but not excess. The majority of your estate is now allocated to the Vermont Renaissance Foundation. It will fund the park project healthcare improvements and educational scholarships across the county. I opened the folder, the papers crisp under my fingertips. Each line felt like a door closing behind me and another opening ahead. This is what I want, I said firmly. Daniel deserves stability, but not dependency. The rest should serve people who need it. Richard nodded, tapping the pen against his legal pad. Then all that remains is your signature. I took the pen. For a moment I thought of Vanessa's painted smile, Olivia's sharp eyes, the whispers in that ballroom. Then I thought of children laughing in a park, new hospital wings built in towns where people often waited too long for care. The pen glided across the page, my name anchoring the document. When I looked up, Thomas Miller was standing in the doorway. "I thought I'd find you here," he said with a small smile. He crossed the room and shook Richard's hand before taking a seat beside me. "How do you feel?" "Resolved," I answered. "Finally." Thomas glanced at the folder. "If I may, Margaret, I think this is the time to make the foundation public. People already know about what happened last night. Let them also know the good you intend to do. It will turn gossip into respect." I leaned back, considering his words. The thought of attention, of headlines, made my skin prickle. I had hidden for so long. But then I remembered the look in Olivia's eyes as she drenched me in wine. She had wanted me diminished, unseen. Revealing the foundation would be the opposite. It would show the strength she tried to deny. "You're right," I said at last. "It's time." Richard smiled approvingly. "I'll arrange the announcement. The mayor's office will be the perfect partner." That afternoon, I received a call from Linda Parker, the mayor of Brattleboro. Her voice carried excitement. "Mrs. Hayes, I can't tell you how much this means to our town. A new park hospital upgrades scholarships. It will change lives. You've been our quiet neighbor for years, and now you'll be our town's greatest benefactor." Her words warmed me more than I expected. "Thank you, Linda. I've always loved Brattleboro. It's time I gave back." We discussed details, groundbreaking dates, committees, press coverage. Before hanging up, I sat for a while in the quiet of my hotel room, letting it sink in. The phone rang again, and I recognized the number before I answered. "Olivia." She had called 3 times already that morning. Against my better judgment, I picked up. Her voice was breathless, almost frantic. "Margaret, please, we need to talk. Last night was a misunderstanding. You must know I didn't mean—" "Stop," I interrupted. My tone was sharper than I intended, but I didn't soften it. "You no longer have any place in my life. You tried to humiliate me and you failed. I won't give you another chance." There was silence on the line, then a strained, "We're family now. You can't. We are not family." I said, each word deliberate. "My son may have married your daughter, but after what you've done, you are nothing to me." I ended the call before she could respond. My hand shook slightly as I set the phone down, but my chest felt lighter. In the mirror across the room, I caught my reflection. The same silver dress, still stained from the night before, hanging to dry. But my face was different, stronger. For the first time in years, I felt I had taken back control. Revenge hadn't come in the form of shouting or spectacle. It had come with the stroke of a pen, with quiet finality. And as the city bustled outside my window, I knew that this decision, more than any sharp retort or public confrontation, was the answer Olivia never expected. By the next morning, my name was on the front page. Sophie Bennett's article filled the columns of the New York Herald with a headline bold enough to stop me in my tracks. "Mother of the groom drenched in wine. Secretly Vermont's billionaire widow." I read the words over and over again, my coffee growing cold beside me. The photograph she'd chosen captured the exact moment Olivia's hand tilted forward, red wine spilling like blood across my dress. But beneath the picture was another. Me at the podium, my chin lifted, my eyes steady. The contrast was striking. Within hours, the phones began to ring. Richard called to warn me that media outlets wanted interviews. Thomas sent a message advising me to remain silent for now and let the Foundation's announcement speak louder than my own words. By afternoon, I watched as Olivia's boutique, once buzzing with wealthy clients, was the subject of angry reviews online. Cruelty disguised as Class 1 comment read, "I'll never shop there again." Others echoed the same sentiment, turning her empire of fabric and mirrors into a house of cards, collapsing under the weight of scandal. Daniel stopped by my hotel later that day, his eyes red-rimmed, his tie loose, his whole frame sagging as if he carried a mountain on his shoulders. He sat down heavily, staring at his hands. "Mom, I don't know what to do." I reached across the table, touching his fingers gently. "You've already seen what's real, Daniel. Don't close your eyes now." He swallowed hard. I can't look at Vanessa the same way. I keep hearing her laugh when Olivia poured that wine. She tried to tell me later it was just nerves that she panicked, but he trailed off, shaking his head. "It's like I've been living in a story she wrote for me, not in the truth." I said nothing more. He needed to arrive at his decision himself. 2 days later, he called me, his voice steady but quiet. I told Vanessa it's over. "We can't build a marriage on lies and contempt. I'll be filing for separation." There was pain in his tone, but also relief. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm proud of you." Weeks passed, and though the gossip faded from national headlines, it lingered in whispers. One afternoon, I visited Brattleboro Elementary to pick up Claire, my granddaughter from Daniel's first marriage. She bounded out of the school doors with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, but her face was troubled. "Grandma," she asked, her voice small, "is it true? Kids at school said you're poor." "They laughed and said you wore an old dress to the wedding, and that's why that lady poured wine on you." My heart ached as I knelt to her level. I brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Sweetheart, listen to me. Clothes, cars, money. None of those things tell the truth about who someone is. What matters is kindness, honesty, how you treat people. That's what makes you rich." Her eyes widened, uncertain but searching mine. "So, you're not poor?" I smiled gently. "No, I'm not. But even if I had nothing, I would still have what matters most. My family, my values. And that makes me wealthier than most people in the world." Claire leaned into my arms, her little body warm against mine. Over her shoulder, I saw Daniel standing by the car watching us. His eyes filled with tears he didn't bother to hide. When we reached him, he whispered hoarsely, "You've been protecting us all along. Even when I thought you were just keeping things from me. You were protecting me." I held his hand, squeezing it tight. For the first time in years, the distance between us seemed to vanish. That night, as we sat together around my kitchen table in Vermont, Daniel, Claire, and me, the laughter came easily. Claire drew pictures with her crayons. Daniel poured us both a glass of iced tea, and I felt a peace settle over the house. The scandal had turned the world's eyes on us, but here in this small circle of 3 there was nothing but understanding. The humiliation had been real, but so was this moment of healing, and in its quiet way, it was the sweetest revenge I could have asked for. 6 months slipped by, each one bringing a quiet shift I hadn't thought possible in the aftermath of that night. The divorce papers between Daniel and Vanessa were signed swiftly without the messy tug-of-war of property or children. She returned to her parents' home in Westchester, and though her name occasionally surfaced in whispers, the society pages soon lost interest. Olivia's boutique shuttered not long after. What once drew New York's wealthiest clientele now sat dark behind a row of smudged windows and a for-lease sign. The woman who had poured wine over me in triumph had become invisible. Meanwhile, the Vermont Renaissance Foundation had taken on a life of its own. The groundbreaking ceremony for Greenfield Park brought neighbors and officials together. their voices lifted in hope. I stood on the small stage as children held balloons, and the mayor, Linda Parker, spoke about how the town would finally have a safe, beautiful place for families. My name was printed in the Brattleboro Gazette, not with scandal, but with gratitude. It was the kind of attention I could accept. Through it all, Thomas was beside me. He had moved part of his work to Vermont, splitting his weeks between Boston and Brattleboro. At first, he stayed at the inn by the river, but soon he bought a modest colonial house not far from mine. We shared coffee most mornings, discussing investment reports alongside garden plans. What began as business evolved into something steadier, warmer. There was no need to name it. Companionship was enough. His laughter filled the quiet corners of my days, and his steady presence reminded me that beginnings could happen at any age. Daniel found his footing too. Free from Vanessa's influence, he poured himself into work, but more importantly, he made time for Claire. Every other weekend, he drove her north to Vermont. The sight of my son's car pulling into the driveway, Claire leaping out with her backpack and drawings to show me, became a rhythm I cherished. The three of us cooked together, worked in the garden, and walked the trails behind the house. Daniel's face softened in those moments, the weight he had carried lifting a little more each time. One Sunday afternoon in October, we raked leaves into piles while Claire darted in and out, tossing handfuls into the air. Daniel leaned on his rake, watching her laugh. "You were right," he said quietly. "Money doesn't change people. It just reveals who they really are." He looked at me then, his eyes wet but clear. "Thank you for protecting me from that truth until I was ready to see it myself." I reached out, covering his hand. I didn't always know if I was doing the right thing, but I always knew I loved you. That was enough. The sun dipped low, casting the yard in amber light. Claire ran up, cheeks flushed, and wrapped her arms around my waist. "Grandma, you have the best house in the world," she said, her smile wide, her hair filled with leaves. Daniel laughed, shaking his head, and I felt my heart swell with a peace I hadn't known in years. Later, after they left for the evening, I sat on my porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the last leaves spiral down from the maples. The world was quiet, except for the rustle of branches and the distant call of a crow. I closed my eyes, breathing in the crisp autumn air, and thought of everything that had passed. The humiliation, the revelation, the choices that had brought me here. Money had not changed me. It had only allowed me to finally live in the open, to use what I had for something greater than myself. And the silence I once feared had become my strength, a reminder that dignity does not need to shout. I lifted my gaze to the fading light and whispered more to myself than anyone else. Wealth does not change people, it only exposes their true selves. And sometimes, silence is the most powerful answer of all. If you had witnessed a truth unveiled in front of everyone, how would you have reacted? Would you have stayed silent or spoken out? Share your thoughts. I would love to know.